Hi, my name is Lavender. I will be covering the Intro to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript workshop, so let's get right into it. Here's the links to the slides in case you want to follow along, and then I've also linked the README file if you want a more like consolidated version of everything that I'm going to cover today. Okay, and before we start, make sure you have an IDE and a browser installed. If you don't know, an IDE is basically the software that you write your code on, and then the browser is just like where it's going to show up. So I'm using VS Code and Chrome, and they're both free. So I would recommend if you just want to get something up and running. And yeah, so before we jump into like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, here's a brief overview of how like a website works. This is super simple breakdown, okay? So it's split into two components. You have your front end and your back end. You can think of the front end as everything that the user can see and interact with. So as you can see, like, okay, you can open the door, you can see the door, like you see the outside of it. And then the back end is all the stuff that's under the hood that you don't interact with, you don't see, but it's necessary in order for like it to work. So in this instance, the car, right? You need the engine, you need the wheels for the actual car to run, but you can't necessarily see like everything working together to do that. Yeah. And in this workshop, we're only going to focus on the front end because HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are meant for the front end. JavaScript can be used on back end too, actually, but in this workshop, we're just going to focus on its front end applications. Okay, so you could think of these three kind of as like the building blocks of the web. Like every website needs them, and they work together to create like the building blocks of the web, basically. And let's talk a bit more about what they each do. So HTML is responsible for the structure. So think of this as the actual content of a page. I'm going to use a car example because I feel like it's intuitive and easy to follow along. But as you can see, the HTML part of the car is just like the skeleton of the car. Like there's no color, there's no like mobility. It's just the template of the car. And that's kind of what it is. It's just like the layout, right? CSS, it's responsible for the style. So the look of the page, so things like color, things like font size, this would all be included in CSS. So now you can see, okay, wait, my car looks pretty now, right? Like I added like colors to it, I added things to it. Now it looks like an actual car. It looks pretty. But right now my car still can't do anything. And then that's where JavaScript comes in. So JavaScript is interactivity. And this is how you work with, control, and like manipulate the HTML. So as you can see here, the wheels, like right now, this car, the CSS car won't do anything until you add like the function that lets the wheels move when you drive it, or like the gas pedal, like stepping down makes it actually move. So JavaScript is just responsible for making your websites interactive so that like a user can work with it and like change things on it. Okay. So I'm going to use a real world example of making a button to kind of demonstrate these three. So HTML, do you see how it's like ugly? It's really bland. You can't do anything to it either. It's just there, right? But you have the content. It says click me, and you know that it's a button, so it creates a button. And then in the CSS, okay, now we add some like style to it. Okay, I see it's blue. It's like it's prettier. It looks better, but I still can't do anything. Like if I click it, nothing's gonna happen. But then in JavaScript, this is where you add the interactivity. So it says click me. So let me go ahead and click it, and then okay, look, it like changes. So basically that this is like a representation of what they're each responsible for. Yeah, so let's get started with HTML and kind of dive into its syntax and like the different components of it. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So it's basically just the language that you use to create web pages, and it uses different types of elements to structure a web page. So you can kind of think of it as like the skeleton, like going back to this car example, right? This looks like a skeleton. So that's kind of what HTML basically does. And here's the syntax. So, like I mentioned, HTML uses a series of tags and elements. Tags are the keywords inside angle brackets, and there's different tags for different types of content. So, if I want to put a paragraph, it's going to have a P tag. But if I want to put a header tag, it's going to have like an H1 tag. So, different types of tags are associated with different types of content, and then you can use different tags based on what you want to render to the page. And then elements consist of an opening tag, content, and closing tag. And then some tags are actually self-closing, so they don't need a closing tag. So here's an example of what that looks like. You have, this is like a whole element, right? And it's comprised of an opening tag. And as you can see here, there's a P inside. So I know this is like a paragraph tag. And there's a closing tag to go along with it. And then inside, this is where you put your content. And then this would be an example of a self-closing tag. It's basically you just don't have that additional bracket, or you don't have that additional closing bracket at the end. You just have one bracket. Um, and there's not too many of these, but is like important to watch out for. Okay, oops. Okay, so here's some common elements just so we can kind of see like in real like examples of these tags. So some more popular ones we have are H1 tags or header tags. So they go H1 through H6 with H1 being the largest, and then it gradually gets smaller. You have your P tags, which are paragraphs. OL is for lists, and this is an ordered list. And the way you use it, so you have like your OL tag, right? And then inside you'll nest LI tags, and LI stands for list items. So when it renders out, OL will be like numbers because it's an ordered list. And then if you want to create an unordered list, it's UL, and then it just renders as bullet points. And then we have our hyperlink tags. This uses the A tag. And then ignore this like href for now. We'll get into that in a little bit. And then we also have our image tag. So notice that image is actually a self-closing tag. So going back to earlier when I said some classes can, or some tags can be self-closing, image would be an example of that. And there's so many types of tags, and you're in no like means required to memorize them at all. I don't even know most of the tags. So in case you wanted to check out some more of them, I've linked a resource, and it's just like a huge reference to all the different types of tags you can use. Yeah, so moving on to attributes. Attributes provide additional information about an element, and they're always written in the opening tag. So for example, in this tag, it's an A tag, right? So this is a link tag. What does this href thing mean, right? It means it's basically telling the link where to direct it to. Because if I didn't include this href, the link would just be static. Like you click on it and it's not going to take you anywhere. And this is just a general like syntax. It's the same thing as an element. It just has like an attribute, and then you use the equal sign and then the value. And the value is going to be put in quotation marks. So I'll give you guys some examples. So for instance, source tag, this specifies or source attribute, this specifies the source URL for media or script file. So going back to our cat, right? There's a source equals cat.jpg, and that's how this image knows to display a cat.jpg, right? So it's this. And then you have your href. So going back to this example, if I were to click on this link, where's it going to take me? It's going to take me to somewhere.com. You have your alt. Alt is used for images. It's basically like a short description, and it's used if either the image won't load or for accessibility purposes, like for screen readers. And then placeholder is just like another example. And then ID and class. I'll get into those two in just a second. But similar to tags, there's so many different types of attributes. You don't need to memorize them. And if you want to check them out, just go ahead and check out that link. Yeah, so let's put it all together so we kind of have an example of how it all works, right? Because right now we're just talking in terms of singular tabs, but this is how it would all work together on a web page. So up here, I have my H1 tag. It says I'm a header. So we see that it displays as an H1 tag. And then same thing for paragraph. Then we have our image. It's another cat. And then we have our link. So if I were to click this link, it would take me to cats.com. So this is essentially what HTML is. Like inside our body, it would look something like this, where you're just laying out everything that you want. And as you can see, it just like it's very straightforward, right? Like I want a header. Okay, I'm gonna put a header here, and then it's gonna display a header. Okay, oops. Okay, so let's learn how to actually make like an HTML page, like on your own computer. So step one, create a new folder on your computer. I don't know where to put this. Okay. Step one, create a new folder on your computer. Step two, open your folder in VS Code or whatever IDE you're using. And then step three, go ahead and create a file with a .html extension. And tip, it's just like standard practice to use index.html. And then once you're in your index.html file, you can go ahead and add this boilerplate code. And this code is basically the basic structure of every HTML document. And I'll tell you guys a bit about what each element's responsible for. So first, this up here, the doc type HTML, this basically tells your browser this is an HTML file. I have hiccups. Oh my God. These HTML tags, this is the root of the web page. So everything goes inside these HTML tags. Then you have your head tag. This contains metadata. So metadata are the info about your web page that's not visible to the user. Like you can't, or it's not shown on screen essentially. So for example, the title. The title, when you open up like tabs in your browser, it's like what they say at the top of the tab, or it's what it says in the tab. That's like the title, but that's not actually on your like web screen or web page, right? So that would be an example of metadata. Yeah. And then your body, this is going to hold everything you see on the web page. So this is probably where we're going to be doing most of our code. Okay, so let me do a quick demo for you guys so we can see in real time. I'm gonna go ahead and create a new folder on my desktop. So let's call this demo. Oops. Let's call this demo. Okay, I'm gonna go to VS Code and it takes you to this page. Go ahead and click open, and then let's see my desktop. I can go to my demo, and then there we go. So now this is like in that demo folder. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a index.html. And then in here, let's take a look at that boilerplate code that it asks us to put in. You can go ahead and just basically copy it over. Let me make this on full screen so you guys can see. So it will be like doc type HTML, and then you have your HTML tags, and then there's a head tag. Then in the head, let's go ahead and say like my first web page, and that's gonna be my title. And then down here we have a body tag. And then let's put something in the body. So let's do a simple hello world. Okay, and let's check if this is actually like connected to, like if this is working. So what you can do, you can go ahead and right click, and then down here, there's an open in default browser. Go ahead and click that. And okay, there we go. So it takes you to your browser and we see it actually displays on screen. So yay, we made our first web page. Um, so let's go ahead and see some of the other tags in action. So let me create a paragraph tag. You can be like, I am a paragraph. And let's create, what else? Let's create a list. Let's say I want to make a list of like fruits. Let's do, or actually, let's like make a to-do list. Like, okay, first I want to do my laundry, And then next I want to eat lunch. And then lastly, I want to study for my midterm. I have a midterm tomorrow, wish me luck. But okay, let's see if that shows up. I'm gonna hide this sidebar over here to save room, and then I'm just gonna keep this page open. Let me split screen it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you can go ahead and save it, and then anytime you make changes, just go ahead and refresh. Okay, there we go. Now my changes have been rendered onto the screen. And let's do the same thing, but let's make it an unordered list just so you guys can see an example. So you just change the OL to UL, and then it's the same thing. It's just with bullet points instead. Okay, let's also make a image because I know this is definitely something that most people are going to want to put on their webpage. This is how I do it. I'm using Pexels, but it's basically just like a royalty-free like stock image website. So let's say I want a picture of a cat. So I'm gonna search up cat. Let me find a cute cat. Okay, this cat's really cute. I'm gonna go ahead and save that to my computer and let me just name it cat so it's easy to like navigate to. Oh, it already exists. Let's call it cute cat. There we go. Okay, cute cat. Okay, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna drag and drop it over into my folder. And then here, let's say I want to make an image, right? I was doing an image, and then remember that source, the source attribute, which is going to tell it what to show up. So since my JPEG is called cutecat.jpg, I'm gonna go ahead and type that. And then go ahead and include an alt as well. And remember, this is just a description, so let's just call it cute cat, a cute cat. And then it's a soft closing tag. So let's see if this works. So go back here, let's refresh. Okay, there we go. Oh, she's really, really big, but she's showing up, so that's really cute. And then for my last element, let's just create a quick link just so I can show you guys. So we have our A tag, right? And then we have our href. Let's just link it to this page because I have it pulled up. So href, and then what is it? Okay, let's try that. Let's put this is a link. Okay, let's refresh. Okay, this is a link. Let's go ahead and click it. Okay, and it takes me to this page that I linked it to. So let's go back. So hopefully this kind of gives you a brief idea of how to use HTML. As you can tell, it's very, very, very straightforward. It's just like, okay, I want a link. I'm gonna put a link here. I want a paragraph. I want a list. I want an image. It's just, you're basically just putting like the skeleton of the code, right? Okay, so let's go back to our demo. Okay, so Okay, before we move on, watch out for this one rookie mistake, which is don't forget to close your tags. So, honestly, the ID I use, I have it set up, and I'm pretty sure it's like automatically set up, but I could be wrong, where it automatically reformats your code. So, you probably don't have to worry too much about this, but if you're working in an environment where there is no like auto reformatter, do remember to close your tags or else you could get some errors. But yeah, so that's it for HTML. There's a lot more to it. And if you want to dive deeper, this is a good resource. I'm not going to click on it because it's going to mess with my recording, but you can go ahead and go to the slides and click on it, or you can just access it through the README. Yeah, so let's move on to CSS, which is my favorite. CSS is kind of notorious for being hated on, but I actually really like it. It really is my favorite. Um, but yeah, so right now our webpage looks really ugly and bland and plain, in case you haven't noticed. So how do we make it pretty? Like, how do we fix this with CSS? So what is CSS exactly? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and basically it's in charge of controlling the colors, the fonts, the layouts, and all of that, like designy aspects of it. So basically it makes everything pretty. And I included this little image to represent that. So just HTML is really ugly, and then you add CSS, and then it's beautiful. So there's three ways to apply CSS to a web page. And so option one, inline CSS. So this is when you put it inside the HTML tag. So for example, I have a paragraph here, right? And then I want it to be blue. So I'll just put a style attribute inside and then put the CSS code in here. So that's an inline CSS. Then we have internal CSS, which is where you put a style tag inside the head. So remember from earlier, the head is where we put all the metadata. So I would put a style tag here, and then inside the style tag, I would just include regular like CSS syntax. And then lastly, we have external CSS. As this is where you link an external CSS file and then connect it to your HTML. And this is basically just like the little syntax for it that you would include in your head. And so in this workshop, we're going to use option three. And I feel like in general, it's better to use option three because the first two options, you're essentially writing your CSS code in your HTML file, and it just can become very cluttered. It's going to make your file really like congested and bulky because you're essentially doing all of the formatting, but then all of the styling at the same time. So I think it's best to have a separate file and then be able to link it over. Um, so yeah, so let's talk a bit about the syntax, starting off with the basic like selector. So the selector targets an HTML value and then or element. Then you have your property. So this is what you want to change, and then the value is how you want to change it. So I have this example right here. This P selector. So this is going to select all paragraph elements in my HTML, and then my property is what I want to change, right? So I want to change my font size, and then how I want to change it, I want to set them all to 1.2 M. And M is just a measurement unit. You don't like really need to know it right now, but basically it's just like a specific size, right? I want to set all my paragraphs font size to this size. This is essentially what this whole like little block says. So let's see. There's also three different types of selectors. So the selector is this part right here, right? Right now we're using, this is basically telling it what to select. So there's three different types. So you have, or three main types. So you have your element selector. So this targets all elements of a type. And this is what we've been using so far. It's just a P. So this is going to target all of my paragraphs and make the color blue for all of them. But then we have class selectors, and classes are basically for when there's multiple elements and you want to style them the same, but they might not necessarily be the same element type, right? Let's say I have a paragraph and a header and I want them both to be blue. Instead of having to say like, okay, P color blue and then H1 color blue, I could just use a class. And the class, it looks something like this. You have the dot and then your class name, and then you have your stylization, and then it'll apply that to everything with that class. And then as for the ID, this is a unique styling. So as for the class, whereas you could put the class for multiple things and they could all share the same class, an ID is unique to one element. So only one element can have one ID, right? It's like an element can have its own ID. So yeah, and then the element uses the hashtag instead of a dot. So let's see this more like in action as with an example. Okay, so here's my HTML. I have three paragraph elements, right? And then these top two have a class of highlighted, and then the bottom one has an ID of underlined. So let's see. Okay, yeah. Let's see what the CSS looks like. The CSS is going to look something like this. I have a class selector or an element selector up here, sorry. And this is going to make all my paragraph elements red. But then I have a class selector, right? Because it uses that dot notation, and it's only going to make my anything with this class of highlighted, it's only going to apply this to those. And the same thing here. I have my ID, and it's going to only apply to whatever has the ID of underlined. And then, yeah, so class selectors, just remember it's preceded by a dot, and IDs are preceded by a hashtag. And then this is going to give this output. So as you can see here, everything is red because the element selector said make all paragraphs red, and all of these are paragraphs, so they're all going to be red. But only these two are highlighted because only these two have the class of highlighted, and then only this last one's going to be underlined because it has the ID of underlined. So hopefully that kind of gives you more of an idea of what I mean, like class ID, and element. And yeah, it's really helpful because let's say I want to apply the same stylization to multiple things instead of having to like access every single type of element that it could be. Instead, you could just make a class and then they could all just share it, right? Okay, here are some more common properties that you might use. There's things like color, background color, font size. You can even change like the dimensions of the page, like how it's laid out, like margin. I can add more margin, like with this is margin, by the way, like this white space on the side. There's so many more properties. So again, if you want to check it out, just go ahead and click that link. Yeah, so how do we actually link the CSS to the HTML? So first we're going to create a new file with the .css extension, and then it's standard practice to use either styles.css or I think like style.css, but I'm going to use styles. And then in the head section of your HTML file, you can add this code. And this is a link tag basically telling you like, okay, I want to link this, right? Styles.css, and then that's going to be my style sheet for my index.html. Okay, and then it should look something like this. So we put it in the head section. You can just put it under the title. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go back to my little code example, my code demo here. Okay, I'm gonna go here. Let's make a new file, and I'm just gonna call this styles.css. And then in my index.html, remember it's in my head tag. I can do like link, what's it, row style sheet, and then href, and then what is it called, styles.css, and then that should, oh, sorry. Okay, there, it's self-closing tag. I didn't know that. Okay, so now it should be connected, but what I always like to do to make sure my things are actually connected, I just go into my styles.css and I just choose a random selector, let's say like body, right? I'm just gonna make the background color red because this is something that's really like visible, like you'll be able to see it. So then let's go back to our example and let's go ahead and save everything and refresh. Okay, there, so the background is red. So now I know my styles.css file is actually like attached to my index.html file. So I can get rid of that red because it's scary. And let's go really quickly over the different types of selectors. So first we have our element selector. So let's see. I want to make, let's say I want to make all my list items. I want to make them all purple. So let's do li, and then I'm gonna do color. Let's see what that does. Okay, there we go. So all these list items are purple, right? And then let's say I want to make my heading. I want to make it like, let's refresh that. Okay, there we go. So this is like element selectors. It's just going to apply it to every single thing of that type of element. Because if I, let's say I make another H1 over here, another header, and then I save that, that's also going to be green because it's also an H1. Okay, let's do class selector next. Oops, let's get rid of this. Class selector. Okay, let's say, I'm going to delete this really quick. Let's say I want to make, what's a good class? Let's say I want to give, I actually want to make this red instead. So I'm going to say class equals red. I also want the paragraph to be red, and I just want this thing to be red. Let's see. Okay, and then how I'm going to do it. So remember, it's dot red, and then I'm going to do color equals red. Okay, there we go. So everything with a class of red is going to show up as red. And notice here how in the list, remember how we set li, so all the list elements were purple, but then I also set this element, I gave it a class of red and now it's red. So how the hierarchy works, the um the style that's going to apply, it's going to go from ID first, then class, then element. So first it's going to check, okay, does it have an ID that specifies something? No. Okay, then does it have a class? And in this case, yes, it has a class. So I'm going to put the class, and so it's going to be red instead of purple. So just like a quick FYI about the hierarchy of that. But yeah, so let's actually see that in action. Let's do ID selector. Let's do, I want this to have an ID of green. Or actually, let's do blue. We already used green. And then let's make an, oh wait, let's not ID, it's just ID blue. And the hashtag goes here, and then it's gonna be like color blue. Let's see how this looks. Okay, there we go. So now this has a blue, right? And then going back to what I said about the hierarchy, let's see. Let's put a class and an ID for this one, and then see which one renders. Okay, if I save it, as you can see, it's blue because, like I said, the ID takes precedence over class, and the class takes precedence over element. So that's just a quick rundown of the different selectors. And let me just give you guys some more examples of how we can style this page. There's so many things you could do. You could do, like, let's say I want to set my background color to like orange. Let's see what that does. There we go. Let's say I want to make my font. Right now, it's like what? Times New Roman. Let's say I want to make it Arial because I like Arial more. Okay, now it's all Arial. Let's say, okay, why is everything super close to the screen? Let's do like a margin. Let's give it a margin of like 100 pixels. And then, oh, oops, is that not right? Margin, let's do 500 pixels. Oh, maybe let's not do a margin. Let's just do a margin of, okay, maybe let's not do margin really quickly. Let's edit the image first. I don't even know how I like didn't notice this, but this image is huge. So let's shrink her down. Let's create an image selector, and then let's set the width to 500 pixels. And then, okay, there we go. Now she's smaller. Okay, now let's see if we can edit the margin. Um, Okay, there we go. So it was just the image. So now you can see there's like margin of 100 pixels on all ends. And then let's say I want this all to be in the middle, because why is it on the side? I could do like text align center. Okay, so now all the text is going to be in the middle. Oop, I'm not really sure why it's like that, but yeah. So this would be like the default formatting, and this is like things that you could change with CSS. But that looks really ugly, so low key, let's just keep it on the side. And let's just make instead, how about let's target the header. Oops, can I edit the header, please? Let's just target the header, but I want to use a class of header. And then you can add double classes. So like right now it has a class of red, but I can also add a class of header. Let's go down here. Remember, class uses a dot, and let's say I want to text align this only center, and then let's see what that does. Okay, perfect. So everything's on the right, but the hello world's in the center. So hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of how to work with CSS and the different things. And there's so much you can change. CSS is what's responsible for making any website, like any website you see online, from that like template one that we saw earlier, like the very plain one, to something like this, or some like to however it looks like. It's literally CSS responsible for all of that. Okay, so now that we have our basic structure and it's pretty, what could we possibly be missing? Oh wait, it doesn't actually do anything. Right now, it's a static page. So static means we can't interact with it. Like all we can do is read it and look at it and admire it. So how do we make it dynamic? With JavaScript. Okay, so what is JavaScript? JavaScript is an object-oriented programming language that makes web pages interactive. So it adds behaviors to websites like interactive buttons, forms of validation, dynamic animations. So some examples that you've probably seen before, if you have a toggle to make it day mode versus night mode, that's JavaScript. If you're submitting a form and it tells you, oh wait, like your passwords need to match, that's JavaScript. If you click on a button and it like toggles something, that's JavaScript. JavaScript basically just lets you interact with the website instead of just looking at it. So, like CSS, there are also three ways to apply JavaScript to a web page. So, you have inline JavaScript. So, this is again inside the HTML tag. So, I have my tag here and I have some JavaScript function in the opening tag. Internal JavaScript, which is in a script tag. So, I put a script tag somewhere in my HTML, and then I just put regular JavaScript code inside of it, and then external JS. So this is where you create a separate JS file, JavaScript file, and then you link it, and then this would be the syntax you use to link it. So similar to the CSS, we're going to kind of disregard the first two options for now because like the CSS, it's just going to make your index.html file really, really crowded if you put multiple like languages in there. So we're going to create a separate JavaScript file and then link that. But let's go over the syntax really quickly. So JavaScript is probably the only language out of these three that you're gonna be more familiar with, like the foundations, because it's like an actual programming language, and the other ones are like markup. So I'm just gonna quickly go over these basics. I'm gonna assume you guys know these, but it's kind of the same. Is so you have like your variables, right? These store data, and then in JavaScript you can declare variables with either the let keyword or the const keyword. Const for constants, let for just variables you want to change. And then these variables can be of different data types. You have strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, and objects, and more. Numbers actually encapsulate both integers and like decimals, so that's something that's different. Then you have your math operators, comparison operators, if else statements, and then all your different types of loops. You have for, while, do, while. So it's very similar to other like programming languages. Then for functions, these are just reusable code blocks that do a specific task. And this is what the function syntax would look like. You use the function keyword, you have a function name, you can take in parameters, and then you can just have like a function statement inside. And then console log, this is how you output things to the console in JavaScript with that syntax. And then you have objects. These are just containers that group related data together using key value pairs, and then each pair would be considered a property. So for example, I have this person object, right? And then in here, I want to store their name and their age. So I would create these different key value properties or key value pairs to create properties. And then now it's all like consolidated information about this one person. And then in order to access these different properties, you could just use dot notation. So let's say I want to access the person's age, I would just do person because that's the object's name, dot age. And then if I wanted to access the first name, it'd be like person dot first name. Okay. Next, we're going to move on to something that you may not have heard of before, and this is called the document object model, aka the DOM. So the DOM is a representation of the HTML structure of a web page, and it kind of looks like a tree with parent nodes and child nodes that represents where they are in the HTML file. And you use the DOM to manipulate and interact with HTML elements, and it's responsible for letting us change what we see on a page in real time. So I included a little diagram here. So we have your document here, right? And then this is basically going to be like a tree-like structure of how your web page is laid out. So in your HTML, you have head and body, and they're at the same level. So they're going to be next to each other. But then within your body, you have like all these different things. And then if you create more things, then it would be create more branches. It's just like nested, like parent and child representation. Um, and let's see a bit more about the DOM. So it has a bunch of methods you can use to do things like access elements on the web page, right? Or modify an element's content or change the style of an element. And then you can even dynamically add new HTML elements and remove existing ones. So in this example, I would create a new paragraph element with this like line of code. Then I would set that content to something, and then I would append that to my body. So then it actually shows up on the page. So this might not make too much sense right now, but in my demo, I'll kind of break this down a little more so you can see in real time. But essentially, you just need to know like the DOM lets you work with like the HTML elements and change what you see on screen and then kind of like edit them, right? So interact with them. Okay. Event handlers. Event handlers are code that listen for certain triggers and do something in response. So for example, the action of submitting a form, I forgot to put that there, but it could be broken down like this. So you have your submit button. Let's say I go ahead and click my submit button. Once I click my submit button, it's going to send my form to some database, right? But this won't happen unless this happens. So clicking the button can be thought of as a trigger, and then submitting the form to the database would be the response. So the code would look something like this. So I would get that button from my document. I would get that button from my DOM, right? And I would set it to a variable. Then using this like variable, I can set a trigger to it. So that my trigger would be like on click, for instance. And then in that trigger, once it's been triggered, this is the response. It's going to run this function. And what this function does is just going to like say submit form, right? And then different types of event handlers include like on click, on mouse over, on change, and similar to basically everything we've been talking about, there's so many different types. So if you want to like look at them, you can go ahead and click on this link to check them out. Okay, so let's learn how to link our JavaScript to our HTML. It's kind of just like the CSS. So you create a new file with a JavaScript extension, and it's standard practice to use like script.js, main.js, or index.js, but I'm going to use script.js. And then in the head section of your HTML file, go ahead and add this, and this basically just links your JavaScript file to your index.html file. So I'm going to go ahead and demo that. So let's go back to my demo here, and then let's create a new file called script.js. Then in my index.html file, in my head, right, I'm going to do script src equals script.js and then defer. So defer is not too important right now, but essentially what defer does is, let's say when I'm working with my JavaScript, I'm going to need all of my HTML elements to load, right, before I can work with them. If you don't include defer, but you include this at the top of the page, it's just going to link it, but then in the JavaScript, let's say you want to like edit certain things in your HTML, it's going to be like, okay, wait, you haven't even made those things yet. So defer basically just says wait till this whole page is loaded and then you could like link them. That's basically what defer does, but you don't need to know too much about that for now. So let's test that my JavaScript file is actually connected. So I'm going to do a simple console log. And remember, console log is how you output things to the console. So let's go back to my web page and hello. Let's see if I can. Okay, go back to my webpage. Let me just refresh really quickly. And then I'm going to go to inspect. And inspect, this is how you see like your developer tools. And this is where you find your console. So over here, it automatically takes you to the elements tag, but we can just go to console. And there we go. Okay, it says hello world. And let's say I want to say like goodbye world, just to test. I rerun it. Okay, there. Okay, so now I know my file, my JavaScript file is actually connected to my HTML file. So now I can actually start like doing things with it. So let's make a simple button right here at the top of my page. I'm gonna make a button and I'm gonna call it click me. And then let me just give it an ID, or let me give it a class of button. Let's do like my button. And let's go down to our CSS page. Let's just change this really quickly and let's make her pretty. Let's give her like a background color of purple. Let's give her 2 pixels, okay, 5 pixels. And let's see what that does. We'll make her pretty. Okay, she's like kind of pretty. Let's make the color white so you can see her. Okay, so we have this cute little button here. And then how do I use the DOM to get this button? So remember, the DOM has a bunch of methods and it allows you to interact with different things on the screen. So one that you're going to be using constantly, or you're probably going to be using, is the get element by da da da. So for example, I'm going to create a variable. Let's call it button. Okay. And I'm going to use the document get element by, you know what? Let me change this to an ID. So then we can use the get element by ID. But get element by ID, and then what is ID? It's like button, right? Or is it my button? My button, I think. Yeah, the ID is my button. Next, what we can do, we can create an event listener for this. So remember, let's say one of them is on click. So on click, and then this is going to be the trigger, like I mentioned. This will be the response. So in the response, what function? Let's just make the function say alert, I was clicked. Okay, let's see if this works. So I refresh my page, I click it, it doesn't work. Button document dot get element by ID button on click. Edit, like save it. Okay, let's try that. Okay, there we go. Okay, I just didn't save it. Okay, click me, right? And then now once I click it, wait, let's do this again. Okay, I'm gonna click it. Okay, this is the response, right? It triggers the response and it says I was clicked. Okay, so let's see what else we could do using like the DOM and the event listeners. So let's say instead of just like alerting something, I like actually want the button to do something. Let's say click me to add a paragraph. And let's say when I click this, I want like a paragraph to actually appear on the screen. So really quickly, I'm just going to comment out all of the rest of my code just so it's not super cluttered. Let's see. Okay, Right now, everything else should be commented out. Okay, click me to add a paragraph. And then right now, it still says I was clicked because I didn't like connect that yet. What I can do, let's do const paragraph. And one of the DOM element or methods is creating a new element. So let's say I want to create a new element of type P because that's paragraph. And then let's set that content, the text content of that, to I was dynamically created. Dynamically created. Okay. And then let's delete this. So how do I make this show up, right? When I click the button, we can use a DOM method called append child. So I would do document.body append child because we want it in the body of the element or document, right? And then you can append that paragraph. So, oh, I spelled that wrong. So let me go ahead and test this. So click me down a paragraph and oh my God, it like dynamically created a paragraph. So hopefully this gives you an idea of like how powerful the DOM is and how powerful JavaScript, because using JavaScript is what's going to allow you to actually like change things on your web page and let the user like interact with it and make it responsive to the user. But yeah, so that is basically let's go back to our slideshow. Okay, so there's so much more to learn about JavaScript. So if you're interested, check this awesome resource out. So go ahead and you can check out the links in either the README or the slides. And yeah, so that's the end of this workshop. If you're still kind of confused, you can go ahead and ask any like ACM officer for help. But for these three, at least, I definitely recommend kind of getting a good foundation because they are kind of like the building blocks of the web. So having a solid foundation in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is going to let you have a lot more like knowledge, especially when you start like incorporating things like libraries and frameworks and all of that stuff. And if you don't know what that is, it's okay. But having a good like foundation in the basics is always great. I feel like for anything in life. So definitely applicable to this. But yeah, so happy hacking. I hope you guys have so much fun at HOTH. And yeah, I hope this was helpful. And I can't wait to see all the cool projects that everyone makes. But yeah, so bye.